Welcome back to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, a weekly radio news magazine that we put together for you at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. Find out more about us at virginiainstitute.org. Our next guest, back from the Family Foundation, Todd Gathje, is on with us. He's the Director of Government Relations, and when last we visited with the Family Foundation, we were finding out that, surprisingly, the Southern Poverty Law Center has branched out into educational curriculum consulting, and the pushback continues on there. Certainly one of the most visible and despite the media's best effort to ignore the passions of parents pushing back against their school boards, certainly an interesting scene of government relations these days. Todd, welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me back.
Well, thank you for everything the Family Foundation does in defense of children and trying to keep families together. If only we did a better job planning for parenthood. I guess that's the problem when the organization called Planned Parenthood is actually more about planned obsolescence or planned euthanasia. Todd, let's get into some of the new laws that went into effect July 1st here in the Commonwealth regarding life and children and families in general. What are some of the worst ones out there that we really hope can be undone come a new General Assembly next year?
Yeah, that's a great question. This summer, school boards across Virginia have really been exploding over this critical race theory. And, of course, we've talked about the model transgender policies that the Virginia Department of Education have created that we're battling at the local school board level. And so many parents and citizens have risen up to oppose. But we can't take our eye off the fact that there are some new laws that are going into effect that have gone into effect on July 1. There are, certainly some legislation that dealt with the life issue. You would think in 2020, after they stripped away about 40 years of pro-life achievements, that things like the ultrasound requirement or informed consent, that they kind of achieved what they wanted to, but they now want to try and make sure that taxpayers are footing the bill for the abortion of more innocent unborn babies. Legislation was passed, in fact, that would allow the participating providers, insurance providers, through the health exchange, Virginia's health exchange, they may now include in their requirements the ability to provide for abortions. And although that it's not a direct payment and it's an option, the taxpayers of Virginia actually help pay to maintain that program and even subsidize some of the coverage that Virginia does provide.
And informed consent, Virginians are being conscripted into this, at the threat of losing their property, going to jail. This isn't some voluntary contribution to an organization that you might happen to agree with. This is confiscation of your money, and I'm sure I have friends on the left who would be just as salty if they found out that money was going to the NRA for staffing at local gun ranges.
That's absolutely right. Yeah, this year, with passage of this legislation and signing it into law, now taxpayers are having to do the work for government. We're having to, in effect, adopt their radical view of this pro-abortion stance. Along the same lines, when we talk about taxation, we can't overlook the fact that they did include in the budget a joint tax committee to study more of Virginia's tax laws and the tax code, looking at the different expenditures and the deductions. And, we're concerned that could lead to eliminating important school choice, tax exemptions there.
Right.
But also even lead to the increase of taxes. So, they're just seeing ways that they can not only accumulate more of our hard-earned money, but also find ways to spend them on radical issues like abortion.
Well, and that's been the most frustrating part of it is we understand, police officers and firefighters and highways need to be maintained, and there are core functions of government that we voluntarily associate with our taxes, but we've gotten to a place where the schools have become indoctrination centers. It used to be commonplace for people to say, oh, social engineering is what the government does with the military because it's the only place they really control the environment. But after all these years of Department of Education funding through Washington, D.C., Todd, it seems like the federal government thinks it runs our schools now, and they have to do what the federal government says.
Yeah, that's a great point. We believe that there is a role for constitutionally protected or constitutionally approved ways of spending taxpayer dollars, but it should be no more than that. And that this particular government, in particular this governor, seems to find ways to spend our money on things that are not necessarily falling under that constitutional requirement. One area might be, for example, cultural competency training for public school teachers. Now they're having to go through and take this training in order to advance Marxist type of philosophies, turning away from what students really need to be learning about math and science and reading and writing, and having to focus on, as you were talking about, some of these more social engineering types of issues. And it's doing a complete disservice to our young children, indoctrinating them with the wrong sets of ideas, and making them think that they are somehow they are oppressors, or that they are less than another child next to them. That it really does a disservice to our school system. So you're right that we need to be more aware of how our public dollars are being spent as we move forward.
Todd Gathje is on with us, Director of Government Relations at the Family Foundation. It's what he does. He wants to make sure that, as government goes about its business, that it isn't overreaching. And I think that's what you were just talking about there, is this overreach into social engineering. And
I think we've really turned our schools into some type of cultural experiment, and I feel really bad for my children who are coming up through public education and other families who are really and that's not to say that there aren't good school divisions in Virginia. There are some that have really good academics. I think our concern too is, what are we doing to our young? What is the world that we're creating for our young kids? Another dangerous piece of legislation that passed was which everyone I'm sure has heard about by now, is the legalization of marijuana. On July 1, up to 1 ounce is now legal, in addition to homegrown marijuana. Young kids are going to have access to this. How dangerous is that going to be? How impactful is that going to be on families? Now, we know that the commercialization will be coming up in 2024. I think that the listeners need to be aware that the legislation regarding the commercialization component of marijuana has to be reenacted by the 2022 General Assembly. In addition to that, there's also an opt-out in there for local school divisions. So you could petition your local your local Board of Supervisors to opt out of this. But that speaks to a really important issue, which is that elections have consequences. So, if you want to make sure you have a pro-life, pro-family, a conservative value system in the legislature, elections matter, and all 100 of the House of Delegates will be up, as well as everyone knows, the 3 statewide offices for governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general. So the people, the citizens of Virginia, can really have an impact on issues like marijuana going forward, especially in the upcoming General Assembly session.
What are any that were good for families that came out of this General Assembly?
It really is hard to find some of those silver linings, especially over the past 2 years. We have laws where parents could be sued because they hire a nanny, a female nanny, over a male nanny. That's under some legislation passed that we called the nanny state laws that would create this new domestic employee under the Human Rights Act. But it's very serious. Not only that, I mean, they can also allow the commissioner, the government, to be able to come in and investigate your house and your home. But yeah, there were some things that happened this session. We were able to see some legislation passed that would ensure that clergy have access to hospitals and nursing facilities during a declared state of emergency. It was a step in the right direction. We already felt like constitutionally, there was already something there in place for them to have access, but this was a decent piece of legislation that provided some help to those who were sick, who really wanted to have access to their pastors and clergy. We did see legislation that would at least allow for parents to have the option to send their children back to in-person schooling.
Sure.
And so this bill, as everyone knows, it was carried by Senator Donovan. It did kind of go through the legislative process. It started out a very simple bill, and there were some more guidelines and regulations that were put in place, but it's still a step in the right direction. And so we also follow the gambling issue here in Virginia.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
And we were pleased with the fact that the so-called skill games, these are these machines that appear in truck stops and maybe some bars or other convenience stores that just sit there, and people will sit there and put in money and play those games, and it really it goes after those who can least afford to lose.
Yeah.
And so we were pleased to see that those will be prohibited or are prohibited beginning July 1. I know that there's some court cases out there addressing this, but we just want to make sure that our that families, that people are being protected from harmful situations. Situations where they're going to be spending money in areas, especially during a pandemic climate when businesses are closed and the economic climate is uncertain. We want to make sure that we're not preying off of people who can least afford to lose.
Todd, I want to ask you about this in abstract, but we just watched California vote to bail out their marijuana industry. I refer to it as depenalization because they can't just overrule federal law, so they've just decided there's no penalty for it. And I wonder what happens the first time that gets applied in a fanciful way. But it's another fool's errand that we heard about when they said we'll tax cigarettes and we'll have enough money to give everybody health care. We see it with alcohol sales, and we see it with this online sports gaming. $1 billion in the first quarter of it being legalized. But these are the things you look at Atlantic City and how destitute the city is, or go a block off of the Strip in Las Vegas. Are we on a fool's errand to just go after these Pyrrhic, shiny objects?
Yeah, it really does seem like we're pursuing all the wrong things. In 2020, we passed legislation to expand sports betting and casino gambling. And so now you're preying off of those who can least afford to lose. And then you take and you expand, you legalize marijuana, and the whole objective is to try and raise as much tax revenue as possible so that you can then be able to fund all of those radical leftist policies like cultural competency training, or being able to fund all of these new positions at the Attorney General's office to go after religious liberty. And so it's all about raising the tax revenue. You know who loses is the families.
Yeah.
It's the young kids. And I think we really need to have a serious discussion about what is the objective in our government, in our form of government here in Virginia. Do we not want to say, hey, even though that may raise a certain amount of tax revenue, shouldn't we give our families a break? Shouldn't we say, hey, look, we're not going to put our children in a compromising position where we have legalized marijuana that's more accessible, that is going to end up in schools more readily, that can hook these children and then send them on a path towards more harmful drugs? Don't you think that is more important? Here's one interesting thing about this whole discussion. Not once did it ever go to a health committee.
Oh my gosh.
It was in the criminal justice and it was in just your general laws committees, but not once did they ever discuss the health complications that are associated with marijuana. That is what's so troubling about this particular majority in the General Assembly as well as in the governor's mansion, that they're pursuing ways to raise tax revenue to fund more radical leftist policies.
Todd Gathje here from the Family Foundation. You had mentioned what kind of world are we making for our kids. I worry about what we're making our kids into. We are now, conservatively speaking, 25 years since the first everybody gets a trophy policies were put into youth athletics under the auspices, and I'm sure it was a lie when they said it, that it was going to create self-esteem in our kids, which is it's actually done the opposite. But these programs like the justice education, these will imprint on these young people because they're just looking for answers, and I worry that they're going to wind up like these kids who think everybody gets a trophy for just showing up now that they're in the adult world.
Yeah, in Virginia, we used to have a well recognized education system, and the problem is when you start to do all of this social engineering, when you start to pass all of this legislation that emphasizes certain types of cultural preferences and this indoctrination, this Marxist theory, this philosophy, it takes a toll, and it's going to continue to lower our standards, and it's going to continue to lower the education achievements, and we're going to start to see Virginia really fall behind. And that's why many families, we've seen the percentages that a number of families are starting to move towards private education as well as homeschool education. Homeschooling, especially during the pandemic period, increased significantly. Yeah. And I think it's just a matter of parents are realizing, hey, what's being taught in schools is not what my child needs in order to be successful in life, to be able to have a good job, to be able to provide for a family. No, instead it's a way to just kind of force these radical ideas on them. So they're finding alternative ways to get the education that their child needs.
Mm. What about the campaign issues? And again, I don't want to get into personalities about it, but one party's candidates for statewide office, at least the executive branch ones, were very much vocal proponents of money follows the child in Virginia, and if Virginia can pass real school choice, because of the Virginia Act for Religious Freedom, which I call the grandfather of all Blaine amendments, I think it opens the floodgates for other states to say, oh, is that how they did it? They had one written by Jefferson. Ours was written much more recently, and we can do the same thing. Is there the possibility that we could see a real sea change in school choice next year?
There's a chance. I think you're going to have all of the right elements in place. You're going to have a General Assembly that is willing to really make the effort to put in place some strong education amendments and revisions to really to promote education opportunities. It's good for public schools. It's good for private schools and homeschooling. It's competition, and it's gonna produce a better education outcome. But you're going to have the right elements in place. A General Assembly that's willing to pass the legislation, to do the hard work, as well as someone in the executive branch who's going to be willing to sign the bills into law. Until we have that, it's really difficult to say whether or not we can get true education school choice in Virginia, but it's certainly something worth fighting for and moving in that direction.
So in the moments we have left, Todd Gathje, Government Relations Director at Family Foundation, what are you guys working on in the next few weeks and months?
I think it's all about school boards right now. Your listeners should know that wherever they're at, their school board, if they have children in public schools, be aware that the school boards are considering many policies that are related to social-emotional learning and critical race theory, but also adopting these model so-called transgender policies for the treatment of transgender students in public schools. We're working hard to try and push back on that, trying to encourage school board members to reject these policies, and then mobilizing citizens, parents in those localities to stand behind those brave school board members. Once they're in place, it's there's going to be a lot of litigation that will result from these dangerous policies. Just remember, they will violate or jeopardize the bodily privacy of young students. They are going to undermine parental authority, a huge attack on parental authority through these policies. And they violate constitutional rights to free speech. If you've seen what's happened in Loudoun County, you know that Painter Cross was put on administrative leave because he spoke out against policies that had not been adopted yet on these very policies. So this is where the battle is this summer. And we're expecting this to continue through the early parts of August. So I would just encourage listeners to be paying specific attention to your school boards. This is critical. This is when they make policy changes, when everybody is on vacation and enjoying life, really. We want them, you should be enjoying life with your family, but while they're doing that, school boards are passing or considering these dangerous policies.
And we need to, I was talking about this with Mom here in the Charlottesville area, we need to, let the whistleblowing teachers know that we have their backs as well, because a lot of this information is either coming out from a PTO member or a teacher who's taking a risk at letting some of this information out to organizations like the Family Foundation.
Absolutely, yep. Look, just because you're a public school teacher does not mean that you lose your constitutional right to speak out on these issues. And we are here. We have a law arm of the Family Foundation. It's called the Founding Freedoms Law Center. And if you have any questions, if you are put in a position where you think your rights are being violated by your school or school board, please reach out to us. We're a resource. We have litigation pending, trying to put a temporary injunction on these policies so that we can hash out all of the constitutional issues that and violations that are embedded in these policies. So teachers are on the front line, and we need to do whatever we can to come in and support them and give them all the support that they need on this issue.
Well, thank you so much, Todd. Again, it's familyfoundation.org. Having a wonderful week, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much.
And for you listening across the Commonwealth, again, we are at virginiainstitute.org. Until next weekend, I'm Joe Thomas. So long, and thanks for all the fish.